Tonight, there is a development across the Gulf region that officials there are describing in stark terms. Regional authorities say Iran launched a new wave of missiles and drones aimed at several Gulf countries. That information comes from officials in the region who reported the attacks as they unfolded. Governments across the Gulf quickly responded with condemnation. They described the strikes as an unacceptable escalation. And those words, unacceptable escalation, were repeated in official reactions as the situation became clear. Some of the projectiles, according to those same officials, were intercepted by air defense systems. Interceptions like that can happen when defensive systems detect incoming missiles or drones and attempt to stop them before they reach their targets. Regional officials said that did occur during this wave of attacks. Not every projectile necessarily follows the same path. Some are detected earlier, some later. But officials say interception systems were used, and those defensive actions were part of the immediate response. Before we move forward, if thoughtful, fact-driven analysis matters to you, I invite you to subscribe and turn on notifications so you can stay fully informed. Now, the targets in this wave of attacks were several Gulf countries. Officials in the region did not describe it as a single location. They described it as multiple countries across the Gulf area. That geographic spread is part of how officials framed the seriousness of what happened. Because when projectiles are launched across borders in this way, governments in the region respond collectively and individually. And that is what happened here. Governments across the Gulf issued statements condemning the attacks. Their language was direct. They called the strikes reprehensible. They described the escalation as unacceptable. And the tone of those responses reflected the alarm that officials said they felt as the events unfolded. You know, when governments respond that quickly, it tells you something about the immediacy of the situation. Statements were issued not long after the attacks were reported. And those statements focused on two things: condemnation of the strikes and concern about escalation. Escalation is a word that appears often in moments like this, because officials in the region are watching the broader situation very closely. They are not only reacting to a single wave of missiles and drones. They are also reacting to the possibility that such actions could widen the conflict further. Now, among the responses that came out of the Gulf region, Qatar issued a message that focused on de-escalation. Qatar called for efforts to calm the situation, and Qatar urged all sides to avoid widening the conflict. Those calls for de-escalation are a familiar part of diplomatic responses during moments of rising tension. They reflect an attempt to prevent further military action. They also reflect concern that additional steps could expand the conflict beyond its current scope. So the sequence, as officials describe it, unfolds in a very specific way. First, the launches. Missiles and drones sent from Iran towards several Gulf countries. Then the defensive responses. Air defense systems intercepting some of the incoming projectiles. Then the political responses. Governments condemning the strikes. And diplomatic voices calling for restraint. There is also a larger context that regional officials are pointing to tonight, because these attacks are not being described as isolated. Officials say the strikes are part of an expanding regional war, and they link that broader conflict to ongoing operations involving the United States and Israel against Iran. That connection is part of how the situation is being framed across the region. Regional officials say the conflict has already been widening, and these missile and drone launches are now being seen within that wider framework. In other words, the events of this wave of attacks are being placed inside a larger pattern of confrontation, a pattern that officials say is already unfolding across the region. When officials speak about an expanding regional war, they are describing a situation that stretches beyond a single incident. They are referring to a conflict that involves multiple actors, multiple operations, and multiple fronts. And tonight's missile and drone strikes are being described as connected to that ongoing dynamic. Governments across the Gulf reacted quickly to that reality. Their condemnations were not only about the immediate danger of missiles and drones. They were also about the possibility that further actions could deepen the conflict. Because escalation, once it begins, can move in unpredictable directions. And officials in the region appear determined to signal their concern early and clearly. One short line, shared by a regional official during the reaction tonight, captured the mood in a very simple way. Sometimes the moment itself says everything. It was a quiet sentence, but it reflected the gravity with which officials were describing what had just happened. Missiles launched, drones launched, defensive systems activated, governments responding, and diplomatic calls for restraint, all unfolding within the larger frame of a regional conflict that officials say is continuing to expand. Now, as the region absorbs this latest development, governments are continuing to monitor the situation. Their statements tonight show both condemnation and concern. Condemnation of the attacks themselves, and concern about what might come next if tensions continue to rise. The details provided so far remain focused on the launches, the interceptions, and the responses from Gulf governments. Those are the elements confirmed by regional officials. And those elements form the foundation of what we know at this moment. Missiles and drones launched from Iran. Targets across several Gulf countries. Some projectiles intercepted by air defense systems. Condemnation from governments in the Gulf. And a call from Qatar urging de-escalation and warning against widening the conflict. Those facts, taken together, define the moment the region is confronting tonight. A moment that officials say sits squarely inside a larger regional confrontation already underway. And that is where the situation stands as this wave of attacks becomes part of the unfolding events across the Gulf. As officials across the Gulf continue to respond to the attacks, more details began to settle into place. Regional authorities maintained that the launches came from Iran. Missiles and drones were directed towards several Gulf countries. The scope of the attacks was described not as a single strike, but as a coordinated wave. And that word, wave, appeared repeatedly in the descriptions from officials who were tracking the events. It suggests a sequence, a series of launches rather than a single projectile. Missiles and drones moving across the region within a short span of time. And with those launches came the activation of defensive systems. Air defense units in the targeted countries detected incoming projectiles. Officials say some of those missiles and drones were intercepted before reaching their intended destinations. Intercepting projectiles requires rapid detection and response. Air defense systems track incoming objects and attempt to neutralize them. Regional officials said that happened during these attacks. Some of the missiles and drones were stopped in the air. Others, according to the available reports, were part of the broader launch effort. The details released so far focus on the fact that interceptions occurred. They do not expand beyond that point. Still, those defensive responses became part of the immediate picture across the Gulf. You know, when governments discuss interceptions during an attack like this, it tells you something about the pace of events. These are decisions and actions happening within seconds or minutes. Detection systems identifying incoming threats. Defense systems engaging those threats. And officials monitoring the situation in real time. As those interceptions were taking place, governments across the Gulf were also moving quickly to respond politically. Statements of condemnation were issued. Officials described the missile and drone launches as reprehensible. That word, reprehensible, was used to convey the seriousness with which governments viewed the attacks. They also described the situation as an unacceptable escalation. Escalation is a term that carries weight in diplomatic language. It signals that officials believe a line has been crossed, that the conflict has moved to a new level of intensity. And that is exactly how several Gulf governments framed these attacks. They spoke about the strikes not only as dangerous, but as part of a larger pattern of rising tension. That larger pattern was already present in the region. Officials say the broader conflict has been expanding, and they link that expansion to ongoing operations involving the United States and Israel against Iran. Within that context, the missile and drone launches are being interpreted as another step in the widening confrontation. A step that reaches across national borders and into the territory of multiple Gulf countries. Now, amid those condemnations, diplomatic voices also emerged calling for restraint. Qatar, in particular, issued a statement urging de-escalation. The country called on all sides to avoid widening the conflict. The wording of that message focused on preventing further expansion of the fighting. De-escalation, in diplomatic terms, refers to actions that reduce tension. It involves steps that prevent additional military operations. And the call from Qatar emphasized that point directly. Avoid widening the conflict. That was the message. That phrase reflects a concern shared by many governments in the region. Because when missile and drone launches begin crossing borders, the risk of further escalation increases. And regional leaders are often quick to signal the need for restraint, even as they condemn the attacks themselves. In moments like this, two types of responses often appear side by side: condemnation and calls for de-escalation. Condemnation addresses what has already happened. De-escalation looks toward preventing the next step. And in the Gulf tonight, both responses appeared almost immediately. Officials condemned the missile and drone launches, and they also urged efforts to prevent the conflict from spreading further. Now, the description of these attacks as part of an expanding regional war is an important piece of the context provided by regional officials. They say the conflict already involves multiple actors, and the ongoing operations by the United States and Israel against Iran are part of that wider confrontation. Within that framework, the missile and drone launches are seen not as isolated incidents, but as actions connected to the broader conflict. Regional officials are careful in how they describe that connection. They are pointing to the link between these attacks and the ongoing operations already taking place. Those operations have been underway, and according to officials, the regional war connected to them has been expanding. That is the background against which the latest wave of missiles and drones occurred. It is the backdrop for the reactions now emerging across the Gulf. Governments responding, air defenses activated, diplomatic calls for restraint, all within the same unfolding moment. One quiet reflection from a regional diplomat captured the tone of the situation in a very simple way. There are moments when the silence afterward feels heavier than the noise before. It was a brief remark, but it reflected the weight of what officials say they are witnessing in the region tonight. Missiles launched, drones launched, air defenses intercepting some of those incoming threats, governments condemning the attacks, and diplomatic appeals urging that the conflict not widen further. Each of those elements is part of the same sequence, a sequence unfolding across several Gulf countries at once. As the region continues to process these events, officials remain focused on monitoring developments. Statements from governments emphasize both the immediate impact of the attacks and the broader concern about escalation. Because the phrase expanding regional war is not used lightly, it reflects the understanding among regional officials that the conflict has already moved beyond a limited scope, and that further actions could push it even wider. For now, the confirmed details remain grounded in the reports from regional authorities. Iran launched a wave of missiles and drones. Several Gulf countries were targeted. Air defense systems intercepted some of the projectiles. Governments condemned the attacks. And Qatar called for de-escalation while urging all sides to avoid widening the conflict. Those facts form the framework through which the events are being understood tonight. They define both the immediate reality of the attacks and the broader tension surrounding them. And across the Gulf, officials continue to watch closely, aware that each development now unfolds within a region already facing an expanding confrontation. As the responses continued across the Gulf, the picture of the events settled into a clearer outline. Regional officials maintained the same central description. Iran launched a new wave of missiles and drones. Those projectiles were directed towards several Gulf countries, and governments in the region responded with immediate condemnation. The language used in those responses remained consistent. Officials described the attacks as reprehensible. They called the strikes an unacceptable escalation. Those phrases appeared again and again in official reactions. They reflected the seriousness with which the governments involved viewed the launches. Because missile and drone strikes aimed across national borders are events that quickly capture the attention of the entire region. When those projectiles are launched, defensive systems activate. Officials said that happened during this wave of attacks. Air defense systems detected incoming missiles and drones. Some of those projectiles were intercepted before reaching their targets. The interceptions were part of the immediate defensive response. Air defense systems operate by identifying threats in the air and attempting to stop them. Regional authorities confirmed that those systems were used. They reported that some of the incoming projectiles were successfully intercepted. That detail became an important part of the early reports. It showed that defensive measures were already in motion as the launches occurred. At the same time, governments across the Gulf moved quickly to express their position. Their statements did not only describe the attacks, they condemned them. Officials used strong diplomatic language. Words like reprehensible and unacceptable were chosen carefully. In international diplomacy, those words carry meaning. They communicate disapproval in clear terms, and they signal that governments believe the situation has reached a serious level of escalation. You know, when several governments use similar language in their responses, it often reflects a shared concern across the region. That shared concern was visible here. Multiple Gulf governments issued statements condemning the missile and drone launches. Their reactions arrived quickly, and the tone of those reactions emphasized both alarm and rejection of the attacks. Alongside those condemnations, a different kind of message also appeared. Qatar issued a call for de-escalation. The country urged all sides to avoid widening the conflict. That statement placed emphasis on restraint. Calls for de-escalation often appear when tensions are rising rapidly. They're intended to slow the pace of events, to encourage a pause, and to remind all parties involved of the risks associated with further escalation. In its message, Qatar focused specifically on preventing the conflict from expanding. The wording was direct. Avoid widening the conflict. That phrase became a central part of the diplomatic response, because regional officials are already describing the situation as part of a larger conflict. According to those officials, the missile and drone strikes are connected to an expanding regional war. They link that broader conflict to ongoing operations involving the United States and Israel against Iran. That connection forms the wider context surrounding these events. In other words, the launches reported by regional authorities are not being discussed in isolation. They are being placed within a regional confrontation that officials say is already underway. A confrontation involving multiple actors, and one that has been growing in scope. That broader framework explains why governments reacted so quickly. Missile and drone launches towards several Gulf countries carry immediate implications. But when those launches occur during an already expanding regional conflict, the significance becomes even greater. Officials understand that each development can influence the direction of the wider confrontation. That understanding shapes the responses we are hearing tonight. Condemnation of the attacks, defensive interceptions, and diplomatic appeals for restraint. Moments like this often bring a quiet reflection from those watching events unfold. One regional observer expressed it in a simple line that seemed to capture the atmosphere. Sometimes the weight of a moment is felt in the stillness that follows. It was a brief sentence, but it echoed the sense of gravity surrounding the situation. Missiles launched, drones launched, defensive systems responding, governments condemning the strikes, and diplomatic voices urging that the conflict not expand further. Each of those elements is now part of the same unfolding reality across the Gulf. As the region absorbs this latest development, officials continue to monitor the situation closely. Their statements remain focused on the confirmed details. Iran launched a wave of missiles and drones. Several Gulf countries were targeted. Air defense systems intercepted some of the projectiles. Governments condemned the attacks and described them as unacceptable escalation. And Qatar called for de-escalation while urging all sides to avoid widening the conflict. Those facts define the events as they have been reported by regional authorities. They outline the sequence that unfolded, and they explain the reactions that followed. The missile and drone launches, the defensive interceptions, the condemnation from governments across the Gulf, and the diplomatic call urging restraint. Taken together, those elements describe the moment now facing the region. A moment unfolding within a broader regional conflict that officials say continues to expand. And with that, the process of laying out these events reaches its conclusion.